Greetings, fellow writers. Welcome to our discussion of arguments. We're now talking about the kind of arguments where two angry people get in a room with a TV camera and a cable TV host and start shouting and angrily gesturing at each other until one of them feels like he or she has overcome the other one and browbeat them into submission. No, we're talking about academic arguments. We're talking about written arguments, making an argument in writing. And our subtitle on this slide, asking readers to consider debatable ideas, is kind of the essence of what we're trying to get at in this discussion. Debatable ideas, ideas that can have more than one point of view. And those points of view can be argued and supported with evidence and persuasive techniques of other kinds. So I'm going to talk about what goes into effective arguments in this two-part lecture. In part one, we'll kind of talk about the characteristics of an argument, what's included when you have something that does indeed constitute an argument. And in the second part of the lecture, we will talk about a little bit more specifically about how you construct one, how you construct a good written argument, and what you need to think about as you put one together. All right, let's look at our first slide in this little PowerPoint we put together. And in this slide, we're just going to think about types of arguments. What kinds of arguments might you engage in if you are in a writing situation? As a writer, what kind of arguments might you advance? Well, here's one. Argument to advance a thesis. You've all talked about thesis statements at some time in your education. Statements that can be defended, statements that you can bring evidence to bear on and make a point, something that is an assertion, but needs more than just an assertion in order to make it persuasive. So one type of argument, and perhaps the most common you'll run into in academic writing, is to advance a thesis. Another type might be an exploratory argument. What's an exploratory argument? Well, an exploratory argument, in my opinion, is basically something that is less precise about where you are exactly going to go with your argument. You might do this in a speech, for example. You might explore an argument that has some problem at its root. You're trying to solve some problem, and through the discussion of that problem and raising the points, you might come to the conclusion that there is a government official responsible for corruption, for example, or mismanagement of a situation and so forth. So it's a little bit less precise in terms of structuring it in a formal fashion. It's more, let's look at this idea, let's look at this idea, and then kind of coming around in the end to saying, all of this discussion that we've had seems to point to this conclusion. So that would be an exploratory argument. Another type of argument is a refutation argument. And obviously we're talking about refuting something that someone else has established or tried to establish. So you are taking a position counter to perhaps a conventional argument. For example, there might be some cities have helmet laws for bicyclists, and many people who are bicyclists disagree with those helmet laws, thinking that they are a little bit too much of a protection against harm to people who should be able to make those decisions for themselves. So you might argue with a number of points and good information and data to refute the fact that it's a good idea to require bicyclists in your community to wear helmets, for example. Okay? So that's a refutation argument. And another one that doesn't have quite as much to do with writing per se, but is a good example of how to persuade somebody of something, or a way you might go about persuading others of something, an argument, would be a visual argument where you might use an editorial cartoon in a newspaper, for example, or possibly a poster in a discussion that you might be making and so forth. Making it all visual, or a PowerPoint demonstration of some kind. Okay? So those are some types of arguments. Let's look at some features of arguments. By features of arguments, we're basically talking about if you have an argument, what kinds of features does it exhibit that show us that it is indeed an argument. Okay. Level-headed and disputable claims. Level-headed comes from the argument, from the writing in the work that we're considering by the two authors, How to Write Anything. And they're talking about level-headed, meaning this is something that applies to reasonable people, people who have a kind of capacity to be open-minded, to consider things in a rational kind of way, rather than being hot-headed, being emotional, being an extremist kind of position. We're talking about claims that are level-headed, make sense, can be expected to be believed by reasonable people. But they are disputable claims. So there is always a disputable claim, something that can be argued for or against, or other points of view can be held that are counter to the point of view or the claim that you're putting forward. Another feature of good arguments is a list of reasons to support a claim. It includes reasons for that claim to be supported. Why should someone believe what you are claiming? And without reasons, you just have an assertion. You have an assertion as an essential part of an argument, underlying it, but basically your argument needs to go beyond the point of assertion and provide evidence, information that backs up and supports the position or the claim that you're making in your argument. Then there's an understanding also in good arguments of opposing claims and points of view. Now this is both for two good reasons. Obviously, if you exclude or pretend that there are no opposing points of view, then there's really no point in your argument, and your argument is weak to begin with because you are basically arguing without a rationale for someone accepting your point of view. If it's universally accepted information, then there's no claim, there's no dispute about it. So in your argument, you acknowledge and understand that there are other points of view. And in your discussion, in your structured argument, you address those claims and then refute them. Okay, but a feature of arguments is that there is an understanding reflected that there are other points of view. And arguments use language strategically. What do we mean by using language strategically? We mean that you don't just kind of lay out a bland set of sentences made up of straightforward words that are not particularly emotive. To make a good argument, you really need to have some consideration of the kinds of language and what that language can do to support your claim. Now, you don't want inflammatory language necessarily. Sometimes you do, I suppose. There are cases that you can make where you need to be a little bit feisty and you need to be a little bit aggressive. And if that's the case, then you do that strategically because it's going to work for you. Political examples come to mind, where you're making a political argument and trying to rally the supporters who agree with you, for example, to do something about their views. Then you kind of probably want to be a little bit of a rabble-rouser, as in the presidential campaign we're kind of experiencing at this point. There's a lot of language that is not inflammatory or incendiary necessarily, but certainly stimulating to those who are undecided or those who need to be moved to action in some case. So use language strategically. Think about it. Do you have a word that is more emotional that you could use instead of one that you're using? Well, that's something you might consider doing, but you do think about it and you do try to make use of it. Let's talk about purpose and topic. Okay, what are the purposes and topics that you might consider and think about when you're thinking about mounting an argument in writing? And what do you do to develop those ideas? Well, one thing, you have a subject in mind. Let's say you have a topic that you are trying to decide on as an argument, something you want to make a claim about in some way. Okay, how do you develop that? How do you get ready to make that argument? Well, in this phase of developing your ideas, it's very important to learn as much as you possibly can about your subject. You may have some vague ideas, you may even be fairly well versed in your subject, but before you go about trying to convince somebody of a claim about that subject or that topic, you need to learn all you can yourself. So it takes a little bit of investigation, a little bit of poking around, a little bit of research, reading, thinking about, speaking with others about a topic, in order for you to become fully versed so that you are an expert in the subject you're going to make this argument around. And in developing a topic and a purpose for your argument, state a preliminary claim. By that we mean come up with a claim, an argument, a proposition that you can throw out there and begin to think about. Does not necessarily have to be the argument you're going to finally make when you create, say, your thesis statement, for example. But as you're thinking about how to attack this argument, put out a claim. Put out something that you are going to be arguing as the debatable issue, the debatable point. In a preliminary way, this helps you start thinking about it and gives you something to work from as you develop and qualify that claim. And then qualifying your claim is the next step. By qualifying, we mean narrowing it down a little bit, focusing on what it is you're going to say, and making sure that it's not so global and universal and general that it really has no meaning. For example, you might say that the college rankings in U.S. News and World Report do more harm than good. Now that's a preliminary claim. It's a pretty broad topic. So how would you qualify that? Well, one way you could do that would be to say, the rankings of colleges in U.S. News and World Report magazine encourage admissions officers to make scholarships awards on the basis of merit rather than need. Okay, so you've qualified that more harm than good idea by saying it creates a bad thing in society by awarding more scholarships on the basis of merit than need. Now that's debatable, but it's also something that you can specifically address and dig into and get your teeth into. Examine your core assumptions. In other words, there are things underlying any topic that you come up with that come from shared agreement on a proposition. For example, in our U.S. News and World Report rankings, using example a lot there, but in that particular instance, we have an underlying assumption that merit scholarships are less desirable than need-based scholarships. Okay, now that's debatable. People would come down on both sides of that. But it is an underlying assumption that you are making when you state your claim in the way that we have articulated it above. So examine that. Does this make sense? Is this something you really believe? Okay. What other assumptions underlie this that you need to kind of think about and address so that you don't weaken your argument by not taking it into consideration in some way? Okay, that's our part one of looking at written arguments and some of the considerations we need to think about when we think about what is an argument, what types of arguments might we be getting into, and in thinking about putting them together and coming up with a purpose, what do we need to go through in our own thinking in order to make sure that we're headed in the right direction before we actually tackle the subject or the project of advancing an argument, and that is supporting a debatable claim.